Hello, welcome again to another episode of Global Pause Rethink the Future. So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the indivisibility of a people. So, usually when I frame indivisibility, it's always in reference to our temporality, the sense that we are marginal in reference to the ends that we presuppose for ourselves, meaning that we are a means towards the end. So, and I also talk about the indivisibility of creativity. So when you're looking at I talk about the orientation towards surpassing a way of life and looking at the way how we can engender a new way of life that would transition us out of a holding pattern of civilization, then the indivisibility of a people is brought to the fore because if you're looking at a different way of doing things, which invariably reduces down into a different way of giving and receiving, and we're addressing the spiritual blight, which is that we are marginal, that presupposes that we're indivisible, get it out, and that the people that would be engendered would also be as such. So I thought it'd be good to explore this in a little bit more detail, but obviously give context to what we are dealing with now. So, because if we're looking at a common surpassing, so, if we accept that we're suffering, or we play host to a spiritual disease, and that disease is collective, then resolving upon the ideal of independence to remove the claim from us does not obviously remove the spiritual disease. It just presupposes a way of life that's never questioned, and you're orientated towards that. So nothing is put into play that would potentialise life beyond the way how it's currently given. So a common surpassing obviously surpasses the ideal that legitimises our activity, but then if it's common, the common surpassing here means to say that it's common with other people. So the way towards life would be indivisible, but ultimately we are marginal now in the way that we comport ourselves to the end. So this means to say that if we're looking at indivisibility, we would have to explore that in light of the divisions that our way of life engenders now. So that's really one of the things that we'll kind of focus on. So let's look at, I always frame the nature of the way how time is given to us. So time is given as an economic good. So irrespective of whether or not you're a means or the end, so your labour or your leisure, it's an economic good irrespective of it. So the marginality, what you determine is whether or not you are a means or an end, you determine that. So the market for your time does not exist outside you, so there's no place for it. So you are beholden to an unavowed utopianism. The preeminent good of your time is what you're focused on. So when you're looking at divisions, and we're looking at it from the aspect of one part of our temporality, so the means part, well, the means is obviously your labour. So the division that would exist, as it were, the way how we divide ourselves, is our labour. So we would have to look at the division of labour to have an indication of, I suppose, the marginality, because we're marginal in reference to the end. So let's just look at the end as well. The end in context to whether or not the end is an economic good. So remove the way how that we secure our time as an economic good or as a supplement, and just look at that we presuppose that we're orientated towards life. So to be presupposed to be orientated towards life is to kind of look at life as being unqualified, as much as that you can't say that, because it's the way towards life, as I always keep on saying, which then therefore as a result of that compromises what you presuppose for yourself. But let's just pretend that what we are orientated towards, which we are, but it's the way compromises it, we're just orientated towards life. So it's indivisible as far as our orientation, as far as the end goes. So the division of labour is always in reference to the marginality, so that determines the margin for yourself in reference to that end that we presuppose is indivisible. So the division of labour, the way how we would divide ourselves as far as, me doing something and you doing something, Well, it depends. What we have to look at, if we're looking at that division, is in light of what. All right. So, what of the indivisibility of what we presuppose, but then we're looking at the means towards that and whether or not there's any value in what you do. Because if the indivisibility of a way of life is engendering a different way of giving and receiving, and through being given credit for what you do, so the way how I've touched upon this about that you can give credit to yourself, but beyond that there is credit that's really given to the culture that allows you to explore your temporality indivisibly, then you cannot appropriate that credit for yourself, even knowing that you are making acts that engender that culture. The culture obviously transcends your individual acts, and so therefore you're really giving credit to the culture that allows the indivisibility of your temporality to become through the acts a way of temporalizing that indivisibility. But because we're a marginal in reference to that, this is what we're doing. We're looking at the way how we're potentializing that through the transition from one way of life to another. So the context of what I can do, I can be given credit, or what I can do can be considered to be valuable, right, in reference to what we are orientated towards. So the way how that you're looking at the division of labour that's, say, presupposed currently, when want is the primary relationality, well, you have to look at it from that aspect, that if want is the primary relationality, then to a certain degree the division of labour is predicated off that relationality. So what does that mean? Well, this means to say that certain things or certain tasks or jobs that people do is contingent upon want as a primary relationality. So if you're changing it from want to creativity, then the division of labour changes as a result of that, because a lot of the activity that's substantiated when want is primary would not be legitimised or would not simply be given in a way of life where creativity becomes the relationality. So, like a classic example, how can we say that? So what you're doing is that you're really going to circumscribe or reduce down human activity as such. But it wouldn't consider to be, that loss would not consider to be a diminution, but it would be a concentration of potentiality of what it means to be. So let's kind of explore the difference in that regards. All right, so I always talk about that want is primary because money is a given, and the average relationality when we are orientated towards independence as an ideal means to say that the world in which we share is impoverished because of that. All right, so because we are beholden to an undervalued utopianism, and so that our wants are subordinate even to the preeminent good of our time, which means to say that the world in which we share is subordinated to the preeminent good of our time. So we share ourselves marginally, but we create, the visibility good. The good of visibility becomes a good because of the marginal way that we are orientated towards life. And so if we think that consumerism is about engendering difference to differentiate ourselves, to give the appearance that we differentiate ourselves, even knowing that what we are the aspirations towards life is exactly the same for everybody else, then what you're doing is that you're substantiating want as a primary relationality, and the way how want can be engendered that can be legitimised as the activity that we're involved in. So if you're thinking of to be market orientated is just about engendering want because you have to monetize a person's existence, well, in that context, if you're looking at the division of labour, what is presupposed when want is a primary relationality, means to say that a lot of the activity that can be engendered is contingent upon that relationality. And so say, for instance, like if we're looking at, say, a classic example is like children. If children are want machines and that they are really, it's about enculturating them into the sense of agency is defined by their want. And so if you're looking at the way how marketing exploits children's lack of agency because they don't know what they want, and this the problem with it is that adults like to claim their individuality, that they're somehow surpassed them being children, but they take cues from other people as far as what they desire. I mean, this is the way how acquisitive mimesis kind of works, and it's no different for a child. But because we have more, we like to think that we're independent, and we are independent to a degree, that we conflate our agency with our wants, and that somehow through that conflation that we have absolved the claim that works on us, that we are not emulating somebody else in our orientation. But if the underlying aspiration, that spiritual aspiration, is independence, and I always say this, and the model is sovereignty, then ultimately that the sovereign is the one that you're modelling after, and so they have recourse to, depending on the nature of how much money you earn, will determine the level of consumption in order to differentiate yourself, so will determine that model. But the underlying ideal is independence, so is sovereign, so invariably runs up to the royalty, and royalty models itself on divinity. So the case here is that you have the scenario where children, the engendering of wants is just a way of just, getting them just to want. All right, because that's the way how, business is business. Business is just works on, okay, how can we engender want so we can monetize want? So it's no longer about how do we create the demand in order to fill the demand. All right, so that legitimized activity and the division of labour that's predicated off want would be thrown into relief as being delegitimized. Okay, because the whole thing about it is if the relationality is defined according to that, then obviously that it can legitimize that division of labour as a result of it. All right, so and that goes for a lot of other labour where the want is the primary relationality. So a classic case in point here is that we could say, okay, it might be circumscribed or limited in its orientation to begin with, but if you're looking at like richer communal experiences whereby you're creating art as the given, then a lot of the production processes, mass production processes that we accept as a given now is very much contingent upon the relationality of want, right? Because if you have a richer experience and intimacy with other people whereby it's the different way of giving and receiving, then the way how and you're removing time independent from time, you're removing time as a constraint to economize, thereby, by doing that, you don't substantiate the creation of commodities, but you are engendering an artful way of life and an artful way of giving and receiving. Then you don't have to overproduce in order to generate a return on that time that you are economizing, independent of the factors of production that goes into whatever you're buying, because that's the way how you're going to drive more efficiencies into what you're doing. But that just presupposes that the opportunity that you have towards what you're focusing on is a business, is making sense of the opportunity of a market. But if we're looking at the opportunity for civilization or for culture, well, then obviously you're transcending the imposition or the reduction of human agency or activity into economizing action, into creative action. And to do that, if you're removing time as the constraint, well, the allowance here is the way how things are created artfully. And if they're created artfully, it's very much dependent upon when the need arises for them. So whereas the relationality of want is very much about how do you engender want, if you're changing the relationality to creativity, it's when the need arises for that thing that the thing would be given. Right, because you don't have to work against the constraint that you otherwise presuppose when you're looking at the ideal of independence and only focusing on that as an ideal, and you're looking at the common surpassing of a people. So that is important when you're framing the division of what people are giving credit for what they can do, or the division of labour as far as the value what they have, what they can do. So we could reduce that down into, if we're all orientated towards life, and I've touched upon this prior, then you cannot give credit to a person that is creating something that's antithetical towards that. So a person that makes weapons, and that's their labour, that's what they do. Okay, because that is, if we look at our own lives, there is no way, if we are orientated towards life and weapons are simply the inverse to that, then we wouldn't be giving credit to people to produce. So we wouldn't be giving credit to the labour that you expend towards an end that we would find basically we would not be orientated towards in our own endeavours in our own life, because it's antithetical to it. So the context of division of labour is something that when you engender, when you harness the full scope of your creativity, and you're starting to potentialise, the marginality of the way how you receive yourself, so potentialising your time beyond the economic good, the way how that you're potentialising the indivisibility of a people is a way of removing certain sections of the economy that are predicated off the relationality that is now surpassed. So surpassing here is a critical distinction, because you're surpassing a way of life that has as its denominator want. All right, so to shift it from want to creativity is basically making a whole section of the economy of legitimised activity absolutely redundant. All right, so that is one way that we can look at the division between people, if we're looking at the indivisibility of a people. But then it's looking at the indivisibility of a people as far as their orientation towards its life. So where are the other divisions? Well, the division that we always talk about is ultimately the division that we have, that when we presuppose independence as an ideal. So the way how that we are a means towards the end. So if we're working on the means towards the end continuum, and we're looking at the division of labour and orientating that towards creativity, you can start to see how you can shift. The shift from the relationality from want to creativity is shifting it towards creativity or towards art. And so therefore, if we're looking at towards art and an artful way of creating things, then the division of labour as such is orientating towards people that are expressing the creative their creative scope of their temporality or their life or their passion as such. So if we're looking at it from that aspect, and you're giving context to the indivisibility of a person's temporality and what they truly want to do, what can you do where you feel that you don't have to be compensated for what you do? So if you find that in your life, what it means is that you're an end. You're not doing something as a means towards the end, and so you're working on the marginality. You're literally looking at temporalising the orientation towards you being an end. So if you're looking at, say, an artist, and through the orientation of what they are exploring life, they really want to, and I always come back to ceramics because I just like ceramics, then if they find out through their exploration that is really, they love making ceramics, there's something about that, the art involved in making that and creating that, well then what they're doing is that they're temporalising the indivisibility of their temporality as an end. They're not a means towards the end. The form of art that they're involved is a way of temporalising the love of what they want to do and the way how that they want to share. Okay, so because they're sharing that art with other people in a way of life that other people share, whereby let's say that you've got another person who likes creating implements, so like whether or not it's not like utensils, so likes creating utensils. So here you have the engendering of an economy, because you'll have another person that likes creating food. All right, so you have that likes growing food. That's not creating food. You have like people that like to grow food, and then you'll have another person that likes to make food. So likes to make meals. So the case here is that you have a little microcosm of, and it's based upon need. You're removing want from the equation, and so therefore human activity becomes inherently creative, and people can be orientated towards the indivisibility of their temporality, whereby that they have the ability to give, and what nurtures their ability to receive is the culture that you give credit to that allows that. Okay, you're not giving it to money and securing money and so securing your independence against the they. The common surpassing is the they. And so if people are orientated towards life, and we're looking at a transition and the way how you're potentialising your time beyond the economic good, the indivisibility of that people is the way how that they share the way towards the ideal of that common surpassing, and then removing a lot of labour or human activity that is just cannot be given when you're orientated towards life. And life is what we presuppose. Right? This is the thing. We always presuppose life, and I always frame it's the way towards it. So if we're looking at the way towards, the way that we're a means towards the end, and we're looking at, okay, well, how can we potentialize a way towards life whereby you're looking at the indivisibility of your temporality. So therefore, what it is that you love to do that you feel that you don't need to be compensated. And then you're looking at what you can do outside the scope. So let's get a classic example is looking at the person that makes a ceramics, a bowl. So not only is the creativity got to do with the object that they create, but it's the way, the creativity, and this is the most important part of it actually, is the way how that object is given. Right? That is the part of the whole thing that is the most creative aspect of what they do. Right? Because the way how it's given, and I always say this, that the way how you give and the way how you receive, it qualitatively changes the self that gives and the self that receives. All right, because so in that case, the creativity, because is not just defined by the objectness, but it relates to the act that engenders the dynamism within that world, or the creation of a world, that common surpassing, that it has as its core the indivisibility of your temporality through the marginal way how that we receive ourselves, and then we're animating our marginal creativity, but that's orientated in a way where what you're doing is that you're animating the culture, and so therefore you're turning the culture. And you do that enough, what you're doing is that you're starting to push it, because you have to fight against the inertia. The inertia is just something that, what is the inertia? The inertia is just our way of life. When we're orientated towards, the ideal of independence, we are securing our time as a supplement, as an afterlife, as a Sabbath. I keep on saying this, and we're potentializing that beyond the way how it's given. Right, so if you're talking about cultural inertia, that's essentially what we're kind of facing off with. So the indivisibility of a people, if they share that, then that's what they share. How can they be compromised in their way towards it? This is the thing that we have to look, because if you're looking at the way how people gets compromised in the end that they presuppose, it's only because you're marginal to begin with. You've turned yourself in a means towards the end. All right, so because you're resolving upon independence as an ideal. But here you have a people that realize that we are suffering a spiritual disease, and we have to work collectively to remove that spiritual disease from our lives. So therefore they work within the margins. So how can a person come along and compromise them in their way towards that? Because for them to be compromised in their way towards that just presupposes the way of life anyway. This is the thing, it's just presupposed. Then they're not doing anything that's different, basically. A person was to come along and I'm just going to say, I'm going to give you so much money for X. Well, that's just the given, that is, because that just presupposes our way of life. So they're not doing anything that would not be engendered anyway. And because you're working on the marginal way how that you receive yourself, it's individualized. It only relates to a specific person that can be compromised. All right, it doesn't potentialize the corruption of a way when it's only one way, that's only one person that is corrupted in their way, but they're not corrupted in their way, that it's just presupposed as our way of life. It's just a given. There's nothing that's not given in that way that is not already given in you being compromised in the way, in what you presuppose for yourself when you are always a means, because you've created a division. And this ultimately has to do with the nature of education. If you're looking at the way how that we're potentialized, we have a way of orientating towards the spiritual aspirations of our life that is never questioned in our education. If you're looking at like outside the way how spirituality would get framed from religious traditions, well, you're not looking at the spiritual aspiration of independence, and because you can look at that outside the context of any religious tradition and just see it for what it is, because it has context with a way of life that's accepted as a given, which is a market-orientated way of life. And if we consider our education, irrespective of whether or not you're in grade 1 or you're in university, is vocational training. Well, vocational training, what's that? It's just about you being a means to, it's just about you establishing yourself as a means. The way of life is given, and the way of life, there are certain things that you orientated in your way of life that presupposes you ticking boxes, because your way of life is never questioned. The way is never questioned. The way that you are a means towards that is never, ever, ever questioned. Because if it was, then you'd be looking at the independence as an ideal and the spiritual aspirations, and like I keep on going on about, the atemporal kind of hook that works through that spiritual aspiration. But because education is never kind of given in context to that, because it never questions our way of life, because to do so would then to throw up everything that we just don't question, the limitation of our agency, of creativity, the limited scope of creativity. When we accept the world as a given, we're giving that world over to people that will manage it on our behalf. If we presuppose ourselves as a means towards the end, then we're beholden to an unavowed utopianism, and so therefore we can engender a dystopian future as a result of that, because we're giving power away to somebody or to an institution that's external from ourselves. And so if we're doing that, the culture is kind of beholden to the crypt, to the tomb. It's dead. And so therefore you're going to animate a dynamism within life. And the only way that you can do that, once again, is working back to the question and the way of life, and whether or not you feel that we are beholden to a spiritual disease. And if you believe that, well, then you have to look at your education. You have to look at everything that's presupposed, because it just presupposes our way of life. And our education does that to such a manner that it just never, ever throws anything into relief. It's just not. It's beholden to a myopia and to not questioning. And dogma, essentially, is what it is. And what is dogma other than a way of life that's not questioned? It's religious. Our way of life is religious. Anyway, until next time, take care.